if I don't have a thought that other people find valuable, then I've had a pretty bad day. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that when people are at the top of their game, we find them almost unattainable. They're supposed to be inspiring, but they just become daunting. We're trying to feed our egos as opposed to fuel our growth. And I think if you have a group of people around you, just like an athlete would with a coach, who are solely there to ask, how can I help you get better? It's really hard not to grow.
So what are you curious about at the moment?
What I have found enormously helpful throughout my career is realizing I can't change the first score. All I want to do is ace the second score, which is the response to the first score. I've got to ace my response to this mess, not claim I didn't make a mess in the first place. If you ignored the compliment, nothing bad will happen to you. If you didn't see the thread, you might not make it to tomorrow. Good teachers are passionate about the material they teach, but great teachers are passionate about the students they teach.
So how do you do that then on a wider scale? You know, like when you do your books, for example, where you don't have that in the room connection.
Write like you teach, not like you write a research paper. Is it interesting enough that it would have my students at the edge of their seats?
It makes me want to know, how do you determine who gets to be part of your crew and your gang?
So my most valuable coaches and critics are people that I've come to call disagreeable givers. A disagreeable taker is going to maybe criticize me for personal gain. A disagreeable giver is going to ask, can I criticize in a way that actually makes you better? Right? I'm not judging you. I'm not attacking you. I'm here to coach you.
Listen, I want to say a massive thank you to all of our new subscribers, but you know, most people that watch this content on YouTube don't subscribe. I want to change that. The more subscribers, then the more amazing we can make high performance. And I've had a lovely message actually from Rob, who says, I only recently discovered the High Performance channel and I watched the full Eddie Howe and Tyson Fury interviews, both some of the best content I've seen in the last 5 years on YouTube. Listen, if you agree and you want to keep this amazing stuff coming for free, then hit subscribe right now. Thank you so much. Welcome to High Performance. It remains to be seen if it's a pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with, what is high performance, Adam?
To me?
Yeah.
I think of high performance as achieving excellence, and not just achieving it once, but being able to sustain it over time.
And do you feel you're there?
Never. I hope that my performance keeps getting higher, but it seems like an impossible standard that I'm always approaching and then falling short of and then raising the bar.
It's interesting this, because we speak to a lot of people who understand the power of getting close without quite getting there. Do you feel are you close to excellence?
I think I'm closer than I've ever been before.
And how every day do you keep going to try and get closer? What are the tools that you employ?
One of the things, and this may make me seem more British than American, but one of the things I find really motivating is worrying that I'm going to let other people down. I think often I do my best work when I know other people are depending on me. And that pressure, it's not all pressure. Some of it is a sense of responsibility and gratitude, but it's gone up over time as, I guess, as my books and podcasts and TED Talks have reached a bigger audience. I felt like there are more people counting on me to produce interesting, useful insight. And I wake up in the morning thinking, if I don't have a thought that other people find valuable, then I've had a pretty bad day and I'm wasting my time. And that motivates me to keep trying to generate knowledge.
But that really intrigues me, Adam. Like I was thinking this about you recently. I saw you post about talking about, you use the example of Martin Luther King's speech and the importance of leaders having to repeat the message. And when you're tired of it, that's when you need to repeat even more. And what I was wondering was, like, how tired do you get of having to go out and search for this kind of knowledge and then to try and weave it into a story that then engages? That's quite a demanding process.
I could not feel more differently about it. I think I have the greatest job on earth, that I get to go and read and learn about anything I think is interesting and call that my job, right? That basically my one of my core responsibilities at work is to be curious and to be a disciplined learner. And I can't imagine a more meaningful or exciting job than that, right? That I get to do this whole discovery process. And I can say, yep, that's actually in my job description.
So what are you curious about at the moment?
At the moment, I am curious about what you're curious about and what the high performance audience most wants to know.
That's a really right. Okay. What do the high performance audience most want to know? What would you say, Damien? Because I think we know our audience quite well. What do they most want to know? What's the most value that Adam could give them right now?
Well,
notice I defer that to you rather than trying to find the answer myself.
Well, I think there's something really intriguing, Adam, about your work. And Jake and I were talking about this before we came on. I think one of the most powerful pieces of work that you've ever produced has been that last chapter of your book, Think Again. Because the fact where you share the first draft of that book after people have finished the completed version. And that was the bit that to me really resonated above all else, because a lot of my work and where my interest lies is the work in the shadows, the stuff that nobody ever sees that eventually leads to the high performance. And I think that's what this podcast tries to shine a light in, those shadows. So you're a guy that delivers, like you've won these awards for your teaching skills and for the way you engage. Take us into the shadows. How do you do that?
Well, I appreciate that was what stuck out at you, because that was an agonizing experience for me to go from telling my students, look, I'm writing a book about rethinking and I don't want it to end. And I just want the last chapter, I want to do an epilogue, and it's just going to be a blank page. And the message is, look, I'm still open to rethinking everything. And they hated that idea with the burning passion of 1,000 suns.
Who did? The publisher or your students?
My students said, this is the worst idea you've ever had. You can't have a blank page. Your responsibility as an author is to really have something to leave us with, right? To something poignant or moving or even just funny, right? That will leave us, that will keep us thinking. And I remember, I fought back a couple of times and I said, conclusions are the dumbest part of a book. I'm not writing a book report. I don't need to tell you what I already told you. You can go back and reread it if you want to. Yeah. You can re-listen to it. It's not that hard, right? And finally, one of my students said, what I would really love is if you showed us your process and how you rethought along the way. And I resisted that idea. Like, no, I don't want to show you all the garbage and drivel that I've thrown out. I'm trying to protect you from that as a reader or a listener. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that when people are at the top of their game, we find them almost unattainable, right? They seem so great that they're out of reach for mere mortals. And they're supposed to be inspiring, but they just become daunting.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, the best way to show how difficult this work is of trying to get to high performance is to actually show the work behind the scenes along the way, the shadows. And I think part of the reason that I wanted to be transparent about that was to say, look, a huge part of whatever high performance I've achieved in the eyes of others, even if I don't think I've gotten there yet and met my own goals, is having a challenge network, a group of people who are thoughtful critics who hold up a mirror and help me see my own blind spots more clearly. And that's what that group of students did when they were reading drafts of my book chapters. They would tear them apart in service of trying to make them better. And I think that what stops most of us from achieving high performance or even higher performance is that we're more interested in improving ourselves than we are in improving ourselves. Right? Yeah. So we're trying to feed our egos as opposed to fuel our growth. And I think if you have a group of people around you, just like an athlete would with a coach, who are solely there to ask, how can I help you get better? It's really hard not to grow. And I think we should show that work much more often.
Which, again, so I mean, I love you explaining it because I thought it was incredibly brave. But as I say, that was a bit that really resonated, because that idea of almost suffusing your ego, being able to put your ego to one side to go, this is what I did do, and this is the ideas that didn't work or the feedback that was a bit bruising. And I'm interested in, how do you go about doing that?
Well, I think I learned it early on when I remember I was afraid of public speaking early on. And as a shy introvert, I was just extremely uncomfortable getting on stage. And I said, the only way to get over this is to practice. And I've got to seek out the very experience that, that makes me cringe. So I started volunteering to give guest lectures in my friends' classes when I was in grad school. And I said every lecture I'm going to give out a feedback form, and I'm going to ask the students what I could do better. And I'm not going to have the benefit of a relationship with the audience where I have a whole semester to earn their trust and, show how much I care about them. I'm just going to get evaluated by people who saw me for an hour.
And can I just ask you, what questions did you ask on that feedback form that
It was really simple. It was, what can I do better? What should I do more of? And what should I change?
Brilliant.
And that's it. I've evolved that approach over time when I have more targeted goals for what I'm trying to work on. But at that point, I just I wanted to know everything, and the feedback was brutal. I had one student write that I was so nervous I was causing them to physically shake in their seats, and another wrote that I reminded them of a Muppet because I moved so awkwardly, and they never told me which one. Although my bet is on the Swedish Chef, but. I remember reading that feedback and thinking, I can't change that perception, right? I can't convince them that I wasn't nervous or that I come across as really smooth on stage. All I can do is try to make a better impression the next time. And later, my colleague Sheila Heen told me there's a name for what I was doing. She said, you're giving yourself a second score. The first score was garbage. And you can't change it. And most of us are obsessed. Like those students were giving me clearly, C-, D+, not a good mark, right? And most of us, we try to change that score. We fight with the judge. We go to the teacher and tell us, no, I really deserved an A. And what I have found enormously helpful throughout my career is realizing I can't change the first score. All I want to do is ace the second score, which is the response to the first score. So I want to get an A+ for how well I take this C-. And that idea of just saying, you know what, I'm going to rate myself on how well I take feedback as opposed to, asking, do I want to accept the feedback or not, has made it so much easier to learn from the people around me.
I love that. We interviewed an entrepreneur who told us that make your comeback bigger than your setback, which seems to capture exactly what you're saying.
That's a great way of phrasing it. And it's the kind of thing that I think comes in handy in situations where you're not prepared to be criticized, right? It's easy to take other people's feedback when you've sought it out, or when you have a relationship with somebody who is your coach or your mentor, right? I think the hardest moments are the ones where somebody, there's actually research on this. A group of my colleagues have called it a swoop and poop, where basically somebody flies in, they drop a bunch of crap on you. And then good luck, right? You have to clean up the mess. And I think those situations are where it's most critical to be able to give yourself that second score and say, okay, I've got to ace my response to this mess, not claim I didn't make a mess in the first place, or point fingers at the people who dumped it on me.
So can I ask you for a bit of advice, please?
Bring it on.
Aside from this podcast, I work as a football presenter, a sports host here in the UK. And I get just pelters of abuse on social media every single time I'm on the telly. And part of my brain goes, well, it's unfounded nonsense. People assume, he's so bad, he must have had a family member in TV, right? Which is not true. Or, oh, he's such a posh kid. Also not true, just like state school educated. But every time I do it, I get that. And I'm well aware that if you do my job, that will happen. But I still find it really hard to deal with what I think is unfair criticism. So the only way I think I deal with it is just by saying to myself, well, they're all idiots. They must be jealous. Like, what is the way that I should be dealing with that sort of criticism that I think is unfounded? Because just ignoring it, it still doesn't hurt any less.
Yeah. Jake, I should say I am not that kind of psychologist. So, therapist.
Yeah, but
good luck. No.
Yes, but but I think that you know enough, though. You understand enough about feedback and human emotion and the way that we react to these kinds of things. I'm not after a therapy session, by the way.
No. I actually think it's a really interesting question, and it captures something that everybody lives a version of now, right? Because we all get unwanted criticism on social media. I think my first comment would be to say, it's interesting to observe your reaction to it, right? So I think one of the mistakes that people make when they face criticism is they're basically responding from a place of saying, okay, I've got to defend myself, right? And psychologists would call it the totalitarian ego, where it's like there's a mini dictator who lives in your head and it's controlling the flow of information to your brain, a little bit like Kim Jong-un controls the press, right? So only good gets in and we're going to filter out all the bad. And that's obviously a missed opportunity for learning because there might be a signal in all that noise. And so if you get defensive or you tune it out altogether, you're basically saying there is nothing that my audience has to say that can teach me anything or make me better at my work. And you don't want to go there. And that's why you haven't stopped reading it altogether, right? You still scroll on social media. And then you end up letting in too much of the criticism and it just drags you down, right? It kills your motivation. So the question is, what do you do instead? So why do you think that criticism makes you so upset?
I think it makes me so upset because I feel like I can't do anything about it. So I try the hardest I can to be as good as I can at being a TV presenter, and it doesn't make any difference. And it also annoys me because it changes the way I behave, right? You've said it perfectly. We spend our time proving ourselves rather than improving ourselves. It forces me down the road of proving myself. So instead of I will just do something that is ego driven. I'll put something on social media that's ego driven, and then that brings more criticism. I think, shit, why did I feel the need to prove that or tweet that or share that? But I know why. It's because I'm trying to fight back, and I don't really know how.
I don't think any of us do, but
No.
I think one of the things I've found helpful in this situation is to be clear about who my audience is, my intended audience. Right. So I find myself thinking a lot, why do I care about the opinions of complete strangers? Why am I trying to prove myself to people who are not necessarily knowledgeable about the work that I do?
Are we not just hardwired to care?
Probably. You could tell a very convincing evolutionary story about how social exclusion was a threat to survival. And we evolved what psychologists call a sociometer, which is kind of a self-esteem monitor for what our image is and whether other people accept us and value us or whether they're going to expel us from the tribe. And if you didn't pay attention to that, you probably died and failed to pass on your genes, right? So sure, I think we're wired to care, but there's no reason why we have to care equally about everyone, right? There's no reason why you have to let that evolutionary circuitry sort of hijack your rational thought. And so I think going in, I think every time you're calling a game, right? The first thing I would want to know is who are the people whose assessment of your skill really matter to you? And I would go to those people first, right? Before you look at what the random audience has to say, knowing that they're always going to be critics and they're always going to be angry fans or rivals, right? I'd want to know, well, whose judgment do you really trust and value? And can you seek their feedback first? And once you do that, you're probably going to feel a little bit more secure. You're going to know what kind of criticism is valid and what is probably a little bit, a little bit less credible. And then maybe you can filter a little bit better. Have you ever tried that?
I had one experience where I was getting pelters, and then a colleague of mine who I really respect sent me a message to say and Damien knows this story, saying, you're fantastic at what you do. And that was a great moment for me. And I like to say, oh yeah, then I really changed and thought, that they don't count, she counts. No, that wasn't what happened. I'll be totally honest, because it feels like an overwhelming flood. And I'm sure also, we could talk about an evolutionary story of the fact that we are hardwired to see the negative and ignore the positive. And that's definitely something that I know a lot of our listeners struggle with. At the start, we said, what would your listeners most like to hear? Let's be totally frank. How to be happier, how to be more positive, how to feel better when we wake up in the morning. Isn't that probably what all of us are constantly looking for?
In some ways, although I think that a lot of people are willing to accept more negativity in order to get to higher performance. And that's part of why they listen to this show in the first place, right? But I think it's interesting to think about this basic problem of, bad is stronger than good empirically, right? Negativity bias is well documented over multiple decades. And you're right. There's a good reason for that too. If you ignored the compliment, nothing bad will happen to you. If you didn't see the thread, you might not make it to tomorrow. But we allow ourselves to, I think, react to, to social information, to feedback, to failure, to rejection, as if it is a life-threatening event when it's not. And I think part of the reason that happens is it sounds to me like you don't have a clear enough definition. Well, this is a hypothesis, so tell me if this is right or wrong.
Yeah.
I'm getting the sense that you don't have a clear definition of what high performance is when you call a football match. Because if you did, you would immediately be able to look at the fan comments or the social media complaints and say, which of these are relevant to whether I was successful today and which ones aren't. And you would have done your own immediate review of what you did well and what you did poorly. And you might have had some things that, that you could see more clearly and others that were a little bit more blurry. But then you'd be able to take all of the comments that you're getting and say, okay, some of these are about things that are not relevant to my definition of performance. And so it doesn't matter what those people think. So how do you define high performance in that role as a commentator?
I think the role for me is getting the most out of the pundits. You have to understand that when you're the presenter, you're not there to be the superstar. So it's telling the story, and it is asking the question that the audience at home want to hear. And I think I am good at that. But the problem is, it's not like I'm the footballer who knows whether I've scored a goal and picked up 3 points or missed a chance and lost the game. Like, there is no win or lose. It's not tangible like that. So that's where the challenge comes from for me, I think.
Yeah, so you're dependent on subjective feedback instead of objective results.
Exactly. And also when you're live on the telly, it's a bit like when you do a podcast episode, you don't really know, I don't think, whether, if it's gone okay or not, but you don't really know because you're so in it. You think, well, I think that was all right, but I don't really know. You're trying to filter so many layers of information when you're broadcasting live that actually, whether it was any good or not is almost the 16th thing down the list,
Yes, although I think you just gave an interesting solution to that, right? Which is, if your goal as the presenter is to bring out the best in the pundits, right? Their feedback is much more valuable in some ways than the audience feedback, right? On whether you gave them a chance to shine, whether you brought out a version of themselves that they might not have been able to bring out if you weren't there.
You know what? That is the perfect. And actually, now when you say that, I smile because I'm always having conversations with the guys where they go, "Oh man, I love working with you. You always make me feel good. You make me relaxed." And thanks for that.
Well, I'm not going to say they're your only audience, right? But in some ways, they're your primary audience.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah,
and if it goes well with them, then on balance, right, it should lead to better feedback from viewers.
So Adam, then let's go back to that work in the shadows for you then.
By the way, you should have been a therapist. That was great. I feel I'm done here.
So after that free therapy session for Jake then, Adam, I want to go back to that work in the shadows for you, for when you described about being really clear about what your audience want. And I'm really intrigued about how you've won these awards for being Wharton's best professor for 7 consecutive years, because that's taking information that in somebody else's hands might be quite dry or bland or anodyne. And yet, having read your work and seen your stuff, you do make it dance, you do bring it to life, and you do it in an incredibly engaging way.
Thank you. I'll try to live up to that.
Well, you do. So what I'm interested in is the process that you go through to get to that end goal. It's the equivalent of tell us the equivalent of that last chapter of the book where you broke down the processes you get through. Because there's lots of our listeners that maybe are working in selling paper clips. There's teachers that are going into classrooms where they're having to engage children. There's parents trying to get kids to do something that they might not want to do. And I think your lessons from that in the shadows have got an awful lot to teach us all.
Well, I think it starts for me with, I had the great fortune to have some extraordinary teachers who changed the way I saw the world. And I really wanted to pay that forward. And what that experience early on taught me was that good teachers are passionate about the material they teach, but great teachers are passionate about the students they teach, right? So it's one thing to care about what you're doing. It's a whole nother thing to care about the people that you're building a relationship with. And I think that the time that I spent early on working to get to know my students really shaped who I became as a teacher. I think that, for me, a lot of that really came from the anxiety I had in the classroom.
Right.
And I thought, well, I'm really intimidated by these brilliant students, and I want to make sure that that I have something of value to contribute to them. So I'm going to do everything in my power to get to know them. It's going to humanize them. It'll help me tailor the material to them. So I ended up coming into the first day of class having memorized every student's name. And I asked them to put their name cards down, and I went around the room and named them all. And they were stunned. And of course, then I beat myself up afterward because I missed a couple names and I made a mistake and I confused two students who looked alike. But what they were reacting to is that I had put the time in to try to get to know them before I showed up at class. And that was a clear signal that I cared. And it's amazing how few people do that work.
Yeah.
Right. It's not hard. It's brute force. And you can apply memory tricks, right? You can do spaced repetition. You can quiz yourself. You can build a memory palace, right? There are lots of techniques that amplify your ability to retain that information and recall it in the moment. And I definitely apply those. But it was just saying, I'm going to commit a few hours to looking at their photos, right? And committing their names to memory. And that will start off the class with the element of surprise. It's a way to make a great first impression. And I think the reason that that was impressed upon me was when I think I was 25, I had just finished my doctorate. I was asked to teach a group of colonels and generals in the U.S. Air Force.
Right.
And I walked into this room and it was like a scene out of Top Gun. These guys had flown thousands of hours. They had multi-billion-dollar budgets, and they were literally heroes. And I thought my job was to convince them that I was an expert and I had a lot to teach them. And I started talking about my credentials and I was trying to impress them. And the feedback was even tougher than what I got from my early students. I remember one of the people in the audience had written, "There is more knowledge on the podium." Excuse me. The exact quote was, "There's more knowledge in the audience than on the podium." Like, yeah, that's true. Yeah. you all are twice my age and you're really accomplished. But then another one wrote, "I gained nothing from this session, but I trust that the instructor gained useful insight."
Wow.
It's like a dagger to the heart.
Yeah.
And I want to quit at that point. I'm like, I'm going to crawl into a hole. I'm never going to teach a group of senior leaders again. But I had already committed to do a second session. And I take my integrity really seriously. If I tell you I'm going to do something, I follow through. And in fact, I don't really believe in walking the talk. I don't want to talk anything unless I've already walked it. So not showing up or backing out is non-negotiable, not an option.
Yeah.
I'm there and I don't have any time to reinvent my material. I have to show up a couple days later. So all I can do is change the way I present myself. And I show up, I look around the room. It's the same kind of room. They've got their nicknames. They have call signs. They're Striker, Sand Dune, Gunner. And I'm staring at these tough guys. And I say, I know what you're thinking right now. What could I possibly learn from a professor who's 12 years old? And nobody reacts. Stunned silence. And I'm sitting there for what feels like an eternity. And finally, one of the guys pipes up and says, "Oh, that's ridiculous. You got to be at least 13. And the whole room started cracking up. And I more or less taught the same content, but it changed the relationship I had with the audience. And afterward, the feedback forms were night and day different. They said things like, although junior in experience, he dealt with the data in an interesting way. And it was great to learn about motivating millennials from a professor who's almost young enough to be one. And that was a really different approach than, memorizing my own students' backgrounds. But it was the same thing in essence, which is to say, I am here to build a connection. And what I want to show you is that I'm aware of what's going on in your head, right? I know you're questioning whether I am qualified to teach you. And the fact that I have the self-awareness to realize that and the humility to say it out loud, hopefully shows to them, right, that maybe we can have an interesting conversation over the next few hours and we can learn things from each other. And I think that stance to me is the beginning of trying to achieve excellence in anything you do.
So how do you do that then on a wider scale? Like when you do your books, for example, and you have to, where you don't have that in the room connection, but you've got an audience of like just a homogenous mass of people that you're trying to bring the idea of rethinking to a mass audience. How do you go about that connection then?
It's a lot harder. I think, early on I tried to do it by just sort of writing what I knew. And I wrote a first draft of my first book, Give and Take. I sent it to my brand new literary agent. And he said, if to be totally honest with you, I don't even think your academic colleagues are going to want to read this book.
Right.
Start over. And I threw out 102,000 words and started over from scratch. And he gave me a piece of advice that I think about almost every day when I write. He said, write like you teach, not like you write a research paper. And what that gave me was a litmus test to say, would I open a class with this experiment? Is it interesting enough that it would have my students at the edge of their seats? And that helped me weed out a lot of information that didn't need to go in a book. But it also reminded me that when I teach a class, the element of surprise is incredibly important. If I were to tell you that you are much more effective if you could bring your team with you that you've worked with before, you'd say, duh, of course I already know that. If I instead say to you, it turns out that in this incredible study that Huckman and Pisano did, where they studied cardiac surgeons, and they wanted to know how many cardiac surgeries do you have to do with minimally invasive technology before your patient mortality rate drops? Like, how many reps do you have to do before you climb up the learning curve? What do you think that number is? All of a sudden, they're curious. Like, well, I don't know the answer to that. And people throw out guesses, and some people say, well, you got to do 10 of them before you start to develop some expertise. Other people say 100. And then somebody will say, I don't know, however many it takes 10,000 hours. Yeah. And I get to say, you're all wrong, because in their data, the answer is infinity. Reps never make you better. How could that be? That's so weird. Patients are every bit as likely to die on surgery number 100 as they were on surgery number 1. That does not make sense. It flies in the face of everything we know about high performance. Well, guess what? Huckman and Pisano realized in their study that they had surgeons operating at different hospitals. And when they broke down their data by different hospitals, they found that every surgery you did at hospital A reduced your patient mortality rate by about 1% at hospital A. Right. But tomorrow, when you go to hospital B, it's like you're starting over. You're a complete novice. And you don't benefit from the practice you had at hospital A. And what's going on there, of course, is the team around you really matters. The shared experience with anesthesiologists and nurses and medical tech staff ends up really having a huge impact on your ability to perform a successful surgery. And when I tell you the story that way, all of a sudden, wow, I never realized how critical it was, even in work that's supposed to depend on individual geniuses using their minds and their hands to save lives, how much the interdependent system of collaboration around them matters. And that to me is the essence of building a relationship with an audience, is to ask you a question that you really don't know the answer to.
So
and set up that surprise.
Gap theory then, Adam? Is it, because that sounds to me, I love that idea, because any one of us could do that, can't we? Once we've built that connection, is to create that gap, the gap theory in our knowledge, and then your job is to help them answer it. Is that an accurate read?
I think that's part of it. So yes, the George Lowenstein theory of curiosity that says basically you create a gap between what people know and what they want to know, and then it becomes like an itch that they have to scratch.
Yeah.
That's the first phase. But then it's not enough just to have a gap, because if I introduce you to a really boring, obvious answer, you're not going to care, right? Yeah. Or you're going to be disappointed because there was this big setup and then the reveal is a total dud. It would be like, it would be like if now somebody tried to make The Wizard of Oz and you find out at the very end, it's just a dream. Like, wait, we've seen that before. Like, nope, you can't create this high stakes situation and then tell me none of it was real and it didn't even matter. So I think the answer has to be something that is either novel or practical. And in this case, I think the fact that you depend much more on your collaborators than you realize is extremely practical, right? We have all kinds of people during this great resignation that we're going through who have quit their jobs and said, I want to go work somewhere else. And what they didn't think about was, well, maybe I should take my team with me. Maybe I should negotiate that the person who brings out the best in me is actually going to become part of a dynamic duo and we're going to leave together. And I think that's, it's a novel answer, not just a novel question.
I think it's really good for people. I think it makes me want to know, how do you determine who gets to be part of your crew and your gang? How do you recruit? What tripwires do you lay for people?
So my most valuable coaches and critics are people that I've come to call disagreeable givers.
Right.
So the first question is, if you think about the personality trait of agreeableness, disagreeableness, are people more on the agreeable side where they're warm, friendly, polite, Canadian? Or on the disagreeable side, are they more critical, skeptical, overrepresented among engineers and lawyers, and maybe a little more British than I am? That I think is important, because we know that agreeable people often hesitate to dish out tough love. They're often afraid to hurt other people's feelings. They don't want to rock the boat. They're trying to be sort of supportive and maintain harmony. And so I found that people who are disagreeable are much less likely to bite their tongues and more likely to tell me the truth. But their motives really matter too. So when I've studied the differences between givers and takers, a disagreeable taker is going to maybe criticize me for personal gain, or to try to feel smart. A disagreeable giver is going to ask, can I criticize in a way that actually makes you better? And they're challenging you because they care about you and they want to help. And so what I've tried to do is I've tried to look at who are the people who gave me the criticism that I didn't want to hear in the moment, but I needed to hear in the long run. And those are the people who, even though they might not always be, shielding my ego, they actually are investing in my growth and my performance over time.
So what's the best way to do that? To be a disagreeable giver?
To be one?
Yeah, like what are the tips that you'd share with us, how our listeners can play that role for others?
Well, I think as an agreeable person who's worked hard to get better at this, I think the most important thing is to recognize that the effect of what you say always depends on how you say it. So one of my favorite experiments showed that you could say about 19 words to dramatically increase people's openness to criticism. And those 19 words are roughly, I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I'm confident that you're going to reach them. Completely changes the relationship, right? I'm not judging you. I'm not attacking you. I'm here to coach you. And I actually taught that in class right after that research came out. And then I gave out my mid-course feedback forms, and 3 different students had written at the top, I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I'm confident. I'm like, no. You don't have to use the words. It's the signal that you believe in my potential and you care about my success, right? And I think that's the most important thing to do before you challenge somebody or criticize them. And then the other thing I think that's pretty important is I've started asking people to assess their own performance before I give them feedback.
Okay.
And so I would say, hey, I was observing to see if I could identify anything that might help you. I'm happy to give you a couple tips, but I would actually love to learn from your analysis of your own performance and try to calibrate what I'm seeing against what you've noticed. What did you think went well, and what were your notes for yourself? And then I know that some of my points are not going to surprise you because you already anticipated them. But I also have a sense of what your blind spots might be. And I can say, oh, I was intrigued that you didn't mention this, and I'd love to hear your thought on that.
So can you give us an example of that, Adam, of where you've used those two, that 19-word technique and then that second technique that's had quite a profound impact on the recipient?
Yeah, I've got a lot of examples. Let me give you one that was a tricky situation for me. So during COVID, I got a call from the founder of a wildly successful startup saying, I'm having trouble with culture. And I'm being told that we have a culture of takers rather than givers, basically. And I know this is something you study a lot, trying to figure out how to get to the bottom of this. So I end up going to a session with the senior leadership team. And I see this person basically check off all the boxes of what I would advise a leader not to do. Right. Dominating the conversation, interrupting other people, dismissing their ideas in a way that almost comes across as demeaning. And so after the session, my job is to try to give some feedback as the outsider. And I start the conversation and I just ask a simple question, which is, how do you think that went? And he says, well, I think it went pretty well. I think we made the following decisions, and I was really happy with with the buy-in I got for this particular direction. Like, okay, there's a gap of self-awareness here. And I said, all right, well, let me just reinforce what my role is, which is you brought me in to try to hold up a mirror for you. And I don't have answers for you. I don't have solutions. But I think I can maybe help you see your own behavior more clearly. And in the spirit of doing that, I was more interested in how other people thought that went. How do you think they thought it went? And he was like, I don't know. I didn't really think about that. Well, why is that? Because to me, your first job as a leader is to try to elevate the people around you. Your success depends on making them successful, right? That's why you're in charge of other people as opposed to just being an independent solo operator. And I remember him coming back and saying, I really have to think about that because I have goals. And so my success was, did I meet the goals or not? And he ended up going and getting the feedback from his team. And some of them sugarcoated it. But there were two, I think, actually, who said, honestly, like this was not an effective meeting. And we had a bunch of ideas that got squashed. And even if you think those were bad ideas, you are building a culture where ideas can't be heard. And that means you're going to miss the good ones too. And you're going to pretty soon be surrounded by a bunch of yes men and women who, when you come to work in the morning and you say good morning, are all going to say, great point. And is that who you want to be? No. And I didn't have to do a whole lot in that situation, right? It was just kind of prompting him to say, well, have I really gotten feedback from other people?
Brilliant. But sometimes I can imagine that puts you in quite an uncomfortable position, being the guy that's holding the mirror, And so I'm interested of how do you make a determination of whether you're actually going to invest in that relationship because you feel you can help them improve, or what are the sort of triggers that you would identify to say, I need to just walk away from here?
Well, I usually start by saying that I'm a terrible consultant. You don't want to hire me to give you ongoing advice. There are, I think, two ways that I can be helpful. One of which is I can try to give people a common language to talk about the challenges they're running into and the goals they're trying to achieve that they're missing, right? Which is, I think, what often becomes a catalyst for change is for people to be able to describe. Often, it's something like saying, okay, you have a star culture, which you think is a perfect meritocracy. But in fact, you have some people who are rising in, for reasons that are unrelated to their performance. And you have some people who are failing to get opportunities despite their excellent performance. And so how are you going to find the holes in that system and then, try to make it more meritocratic? And all of a sudden saying, oh, well, we're over rewarding our superstars who have great individual results. And we're underappreciating the culture carriers, the givers behind the scenes who are making other people better. That's a catalyst, right? You don't need me anymore. I've walked you through the data behind that, but you can now figure out how to change that in your own environment. And then the other approach is to say, where I think I can add value is if you actually want to systematically study the problem you're interested in or the goal you're trying to achieve. So if I can come in and do an experiment, if I can gather longitudinal data, then at the end of this project, we're going to be able to teach other people what you learned. And that's a signal to me that you're committed to learning for the long haul, not just looking for a quick fix or trying to have somebody else fight your fires for you. And that's a pretty good filter for me. If you want to go beyond just I'll give a talk or I'll have a conversation with you, you better be committed to not only running an experiment, but wanting to gather data about the results.
Thank you.
Your thoughts and comments are so helpful, Adam. I mean, particularly for Brits like us, because we've all been brought up in a society where if you're disagreeable, that's a negative. And if you're agreeable, that's a positive. So we all walk around agreeing with each other when there's a voice in our head saying, I'm not really sure that I agree, but I better say I do because otherwise it's seen as negative, which is unhealthy.
Jake, it's funny that you say that because I lived in the UK for a while and I came home feeling like I guess I was always, as an agreeable person, concerned about politeness. Yeah. And the degree of politeness that was normative in British culture, at least when I was there, made me uncomfortable. And I felt like I kept having conversations where people would just kind of nod and, validate my ideas. And I started to feel like if two people never disagree, it means at least one of them is not thinking critically or speaking candidly. And that is a disservice to a relationship, right? If you can't tell me the truth, then you're actually hindering my ability to learn from you. And I didn't know it was going to happen. But one of the effects of going across the pond and then coming back was to say, I think the fundamental challenge of being an agreeable person or living in an agreeable culture, or even just having an agreeable team, right, is people feel a conflict between honesty and loyalty. Yeah. And what I tell every person I work with is, I see no conflict. To me, the highest expression of loyalty is honesty. The more candid you are with me, the more I will know that you care about me. So if you ever hesitate because you're afraid of hurting my feelings or hurting our relationship, don't. The only way you can hurt me is by not telling me the truth. And it just erodes the politeness norms in an interaction, because all of a sudden people realize, well, yeah, being polite is protecting your feelings in the moment, but being kind is actually helping you get better in the future.
So to try and bring this into our own lives, is this about communication? Because I'm thinking of people I know who have fired colleagues because why have they left? Oh, we kept on, we couldn't agree. Or even I have friends who've divorced. Why have you divorced? We just got to a point where we disagreed on everything, like it's a negative. So even if it's opened our eyes to the fact that actually disagreeing doesn't mean that you can't, relate or coexist. How do we get the other person to understand that when I disagree with you, I'm not coming at you, I'm not being aggressive, I don't want to fight here. This is a disagreement based purely on respect for you and me.
I think the framing is important. So, I mean, as a psychologist, my first inclination is always to bring the evidence to the table and say, look, research shows that the quality of a relationship, and also actually whether your kids end up well adjusted, if you have kids, is not about how often you fight. It's about how constructively you fight. Kids who are raised in homes where parents never argue, never learn to work out their differences, and that turns out to be unhealthy for them. Kids who are raised in families where parents disagree respectfully, they learn to speak up. They learn to listen to people who have a different point of view. And that's ultimately, good for their resilience as well as their ability to have thoughtful disagreements. So I like to talk about that right up front and set that as a context when I'm interacting with somebody. For people who wouldn't do that, I think the simpler way to do this might be to say, I think I have a style of working out my thoughts, which is to debate. And sometimes that makes me seem like a prosecuting attorney, right? Which is, I'm trying to shoot down everything you say, and I'm always trying to prove you wrong. But that's actually how I pressure test my own arguments. That's how I sharpen my own thinking. And if I take the time to disagree with you, it means that your opinion matters to me, right? If I didn't care about your opinion, I wouldn't bother to argue with it. I'd say, screw you. Like, why am I bothering to talk to you? And so my engaging in an argument is a sign that I care and that I care about you. And, I may argue really forcefully, but I expect you to do the same thing back. And I want this to be like a debate. And then, my wife will say, like, I'm not your debating partner. I don't want to have a 3-hour discussion about everything we disagree on. That may not be necessary. And I think what I've tried to land on there is to say, I think it's important to agree on core values. And it's important to disagree on the best way to live those values, because I don't know, and neither does anybody else. And we're kind of trying to figure it out as we go along.
Because my follow-up question was going to be, at what point do we make the decision that actually we're not just constructively disagreeing on a few things here, like this just isn't happening and it isn't right? How do you work out when you've reached that point?
I hope to never reach that point.
With anyone.
I think ever.
But surely there are people that, like, it just doesn't work and you need to go your separate ways there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think where I start to get concerned is when somebody starts saying, well, let's just agree to disagree. Right, which is a sign that they're ready to give up. And I would like to believe I'm capable of having a thoughtful disagreement with anyone about anything. And so that's a sign to me that I failed, right? Because I have come across as either because I went into prosecutor mode or because I was preaching that I was so excited about my own point of view. I signaled to them that, I was basically too stubborn to change my mind. And so what I will do when that happens is I will say, hey, I don't actually believe in agreeing to disagree. To me, if you say, let's agree to disagree, it means that I need to stop trying to persuade and I need to start trying to learn. And so can you tell me what I screwed up in this conversation that made you feel like this was a lost cause? And sometimes people don't even want to give the feedback. I'll say, okay, if you do not want to have a conversation about how we can have better conversations, then maybe we shouldn't be having conversations anymore. Right? But if you're willing to tell me, here's where you lost me and here's what you did, I can start to look for a pattern. Have I done that before with other people? Is this a topic that brings out the worst in me? And then I can try to course correct it next time.
But I think one of your superpowers, Adam, having listened to you here, is the ability to provide clarity for the terms of any relationship. I think when you speak about going in as a consultant to a business and agreeing the terms of which you're going to go in and consult with them, or whether it's in a relationship, agreeing the clarity of, like that phrase that you used about honesty and kindness are not mutually exclusive. They're one and the same thing. So what I'm interested in is any quick tips beyond the one that you said about building that relationship, first of all, that our listeners can do to create a culture of clarity in terms of of engagement for any relationship.
You call it a superpower. I say it's a weakness that reared its ugly head one too many times. And I've been in so many situations where I've regretted not clarifying expectations. And then I've been disappointed by someone and then kind of wake up the next morning and realize, wait, when I'm disappointed in you, it's not because of your actions. It's because your actions clashed with my expectations. Yeah. And I never told you what my expectations were. So why am I disappointed in you? I should be disappointed in me. So I think that I guess if you're trying to set the terms for clarity in any relationship, the most important thing that I've learned to do is, I see this a lot when I'm mentoring and advising other people, is to ask, why are you here? I gave so many pieces of bad advice or unwanted advice to students, to athletes, to entrepreneurs, in every walk of life where I was trying to apply psychology. People would come and then I would tell them about the best evidence I knew. And it just missed the mark because I didn't know what they were trying to accomplish. And so even just asking, when you come to me for advice on a decision or a dilemma, are you looking to basically get my stamp of approval? Do you want validation? Because you already have it. I want whatever you believe is going to bring you success and happiness. And if you believe that this is the right choice for you, who am I to tell you otherwise? I'm not you. Are you here to widen your options? Do you want me to help you think about possibilities you haven't considered? Are you here because you want me to really decimate your reasoning and you're worried that you might be making the wrong decision and you're bringing me to be part of your challenge network? And once I know that, it's a completely different conversation. And I think that asking that, obviously, if you're on the mentoring or advising side or coaching side is invaluable. But I think sharing that, if you're the person who's coming to seek advice, right? Not to just say, could you give me advice on this? But here is the goal of seeking advice. In a lot of cases, I will go to multiple people when I'm seeking advice, and then they're disappointed that I didn't follow their advice. And what I realized was I forgot to tell them that I have a whole challenge network, and I know that one person's view might be objective quality or it might be idiosyncratic taste. And the only way I can separate those two things is to ask a bunch of independent people and then see where they converge and where they diverge. And so the fact that I didn't take your advice doesn't mean I didn't value your opinion. It's that I wasn't looking for you to tell me what to do. I was looking to gather a bunch of information and then synthesize those different perspectives and make an informed decision based on that. And I think you have a particular perspective, just like I do, but both of ours are incomplete. And so I wanted to round those out. And I think just trying to clarify that on both sides is my most important advice. And that was not a quick tip.
No, it wasn't, but it was a brilliant one. So thank you. Thanks for sharing.
We're about to move on to our quickfire questions, Adam. Before we do, though,
good.
With everything that you've learned and all the amazing knowledge that you've shared with us, is imposter syndrome still alive and well in your life, or have you found a way of quelling it?
I don't believe in treating it as a syndrome.
Yeah.
like it's a chronic debilitating disease. I guess there are people who walk around feeling like, I am an actual fraud and I've never been qualified for any role I got. I got lucky in every success I ever achieved, and it's only a matter of minutes until everyone finds out. That is extremely rare. What's much more common, if you look at Basima Tewfik's research on this, is imposter thoughts. The everyday flickers of doubt of wondering, am I as good as other people think I am? And if you don't have those, you're at risk for arrogance or narcissism. If you never doubt whether other people are overestimating you, then you are not putting yourself in a position to keep growing and challenging yourself. And so I think it's actually really important to have those imposter thoughts. And Basima shows that they motivate you to work harder and longer sometimes. And that they also motivate you to learn more from other people because there's a gap between where you are and where you want to be. And you don't have all the answers. And so you've got to try to close the gap. So for me, I have imposter thoughts. I feel like, a good number of the podcast interviews that I do, like, why is this person talking to me? Like, do I belong in this discussion? Do I have something to contribute? Almost every stage I get on. There's a moment where I think, why should this audience learn from me? And a colleague of mine, Hadla Thomasdottir, who I think is a brilliant leader and really skilled at turning imposter syndrome into fuel, taught me something that I apply in those situations. She says, if you're going to ask, why me? You should also ask, why not me?
Love that. Brilliant. Right. Quick fire questions, Adam Grant. Your 3 non-negotiable behaviors that you and the people around you should buy into.
Ooh, 3 non-negotiable behaviors. 1 is striving for excellence. 2 is being candid with each other. And 3 is probably, it's so hard to only pick 3, but if I had to pick a third, it's trying to focus not on our individual success, but on our collective contribution.
So if you could go back to one period of your life, where would you go and why?
I would go back to yesterday and I would spend a little bit more time thinking through what's the most valuable information I can share today so I ramble less.
What's your biggest strength? What's your greatest weakness?
My greatest weakness is probably that I have a really hard time letting go of a goal when I get attached to it. And I end up in escalation of commitment to losing courses of action a lot. And I know it drives the people around me crazy and sometimes gets me in trouble too, which is why I wrote a whole book on why we need to think again. I think if I had a greatest strength, it's probably, it's the flip side of that, right? I think most weaknesses are strengths overused and misused. And I think probably my greatest strength is my ability to lock into a goal and not let it go and persevere.
And finally, Adam, what's your 1 golden rule to live a high performance life?
I think for me, high performance is about recognizing that the most meaningful way to succeed is to help other people succeed. It's hard in the span of years and decades to keep finding meaning in climbing a mountain yourself, but being able to lift other people up to the top of that mountain, that creates a sustainable sense of purpose. And I think it comes right back to where we started, which is if you know who's counting on you, then it's not difficult to find your motivation.
Thanks, Adam. Take care. All the very best. Keep in touch. Thank you. Just a quick one to say thank you so much for watching this content on the High Performance channel. We would love it if you would subscribe. Most people that watch what we do don't subscribe. If you can subscribe, we can make this bigger, better, bolder than we've ever done before. So hit subscribe right now and help the High Performance podcast make a real difference to the world. See you soon.